Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is episode 36 of the Pontos Fathom podcast, and I'm going to continue the third of our Dragon series. Today's topic, we're going to talk about Saturn and the Dragon. So, we've done a couple of podcasts on the Dragon. The first one was looking at the dragons in Tolkien and in George R.R. Martin from Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire and Fire and Blood. And then also looking at Michael Moorcock's take on the Dragon Island of Melniboné. So that was our podcast number 34. 35, we looked more at the mythological mother of dragons, at Tiamat, and looked at how, when we look at the traditional mythological view of chaos, there's actually some interesting things that we can find there that are switching up in modern times, where it's not so much of a fear of chaos. I believe it's more like a sort of a harnessing and a transformative spirit, right? So what we'll do today is we're going to talk about we're going to sort of ground Saturn into the concept of the astrological Saturn, right? And we'll still look at Saturn in myth. But I wanted to bring Saturn in because I in my research, I found some interesting connections between the Saturn and this sort of what I'm calling the esoteric dragon lore. There's definitely some overlap with Saturn and the dragon. It kind of goes back to the Steiner concepts that we talked about last podcast around Michael and St. George slaying the dragon, and also about Tiamat as a slain dragon, and then changing that myth to be more like, okay, what is that rift that used to be described as slaying the dragon, which is now riding the dragon, or it's harnessing the dragon heartstrings. Like in Harry Potter, some of the wands have a dragon heart's string. I think this is a great image from fiction, right? So fiction can be very creative as it crosses into some of these spaces. And so then from there, we want to talk about the changing role of Saturn. When you look at the way we can redeem the dragon myth and question what we mean by chaos in the dragon myth, and redeem that myth. We can also do the same thing with the Saturn energy. So Saturn has traditionally been a Saturnine sign. Saturnalias. You've got even Satan kind of comes out of this. And Saturn was viewed traditionally as a malefic planet. And I think that in the new way of looking at Saturn, let's call it like an esoteric, let's call it an evolutionary astrology view, or a transformative view. Maybe the Jungians would call it integration, right? Integration of the unconscious, or there's something, even behavioralist, I believe, Adler things talking about sort of a replacement, a behavioral awareness, and then a behavioral change, right? So Saturn moving away from the malefic and being more of the planet of discipline in the sense as of disciple. And a disciple really means someone who is learning, right? So this transformation of Saturn from the great malefic planet into the transformative planet that makes disciples of us all is really what the topic of today's podcast is, with Saturn and the dragon, right? So we're going to put that all together. I will kind of shout out to the Christian astrology of William Lilly and the Picatrix. I just want to go to the oldest ones that don't have any lens and kind of see where we can take some of the indications from predictive and malefic views of Saturn and look for those cues of transformation, right? So we'll go back to the old text with that. I've pulled in the Saturn book to talk a little bit about the mythology of Saturn. There's some very interesting things of Saturn across different mythic traditions. We kind of talked about that in the last podcast, if you want to go back and listen to that one. And then we'll also get into a bit of Bentamago's Moons of the Planets. Just a quick shout out before we go further. We do have a bookstore. If you want to go check out our link in the description below. Lots of things interesting there. Just for fans of the podcast, I'm working on a series to take the first year of lectures and edit them up into some collected book versions. So, we talked a lot about H.P. Lovecraft, Frank Herbert, and Philip K. Dick in the past. So we've got the sort of Jungian alchemy in horror and sci-fi. Then we're talking about the theosophical themes that come up in pulp fantasy and anime. We talked about Conan and Solomon Kane and Bleach and Evangelion. So a lot of podcasts last year on that. And then we also want to talk about that esoteric anthroposophy and like an occulted history. So thinking of fiction as a expression of history, right? So these are in the works. I'm editing these up. Go down and check out the links below. We also have a Patreon, and as you know, if you guys could like and subscribe if you like what we're doing here. We're trying to build the channel, and I would love to get to a live podcast where we can sort of interact. In the meantime, comments below. Get great comments from everyone, so really appreciate your comments, and looking forward to turning this into a dialogue between us. So let's talk down in the comments, and we'll get into Saturn and the dragon. So maybe we'll start out, I kind of wanted to start out with this image I saw, and it's kind of a strange place to jump off into, but it's as good a place as any. And the idea here was, in 2004, the Cassini probe was actually detecting what they called a dragon storm on the planet Saturn. So I just want to bring the laptop up here for a second. And if you can see this image of Saturn, there's a kind of lightning storm in orange there. And this was producing, this is in the 2004 flyby. So the dragon storm was a complex feature with arms and secondary extensions just above the right and center, called the dragon storm. It lies in the region of the southern hemisphere known on the planet Saturn as the Storm Alley. And it was detected by Cassini in that year. So he said the dragon storm was a powerful source of radio emissions during July and September of 2004. I just wanted to kind of call out this, this emergence of a dragon image on the physical planet. It's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of like that hexagram, that hexagonal figure, which is a four-dimensional cube projection on the top of Saturn, right? So Saturn as a physical planet having some interesting features, right? And this is just from the scientific view, not even thinking of the view of things like astrological views. So let's jump into this idea of Saturn in relation to astrology. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the lunar nodes. So the lunar nodes are known as there's a north and a south node, and it's known as the head of the dragon and the tail of the dragon, right? So you kind of have this idea of the dragon has been split in half somehow, right? So you've got a dragon, you've got the head portion and the tail portion, right? And so this idea of the nodes is an opening of a space, and those nodes are marked by when the moon's cycle orbit intersects with the ecliptic plane, which kind of is where eclipses will happen across that, when the moon, the earth, and the sun are sort of aligned on that plane. But so the north node is when it crosses in the north, and the south node is when it crosses, and they call that the dragonic period, which I thought was interesting. I don't know the origins of this. If anybody knows the lunar nodes really well, please leave a comment below. I think it's very interesting. So one thing that's interesting of the lunar nodes as the dragon, I want to talk about two things here. The first one is I'll talk a little bit about the idea of Marduk splitting Tiamat, and maybe we could think about why that is in relation to the nodes and fortune. And then also just to talk about the idea of Saturn as an aspect to the lunar nodes astrologically. And this is where we can talk about the esoteric Saturn with like an esoteric Tiamat, and think of some hypotheticals that you could go into and research, right? And finally, I think we can kind of enter this with the idea of the Chinese dragons. Like there's in again, I talked about the fountain of Saint Michel in Paris, where there's Saint Michael standing on Satan, who's in human form, and then he's flanked by two dragons. And I thought of that was an interesting architecture, in the sense that the dragons weren't being slain. We have that Saint George slaying the dragon. In this case, what Michael was slaying was the devilish man, and the dragons were standing guarding sort of these gateways. And you often see in Chinese architecture in temples, the Chinese dragons will guard each side of the temple. There'll be one on one side, and then as you go through that portal, you're sort of guarded by these dragons that flank. And I feel that this is sort of the mood of this esoteric Saturn and Tiamat relationship, right? So let's think about the lunar nodes, again, the head and the tail split, and that space that opens up becomes the idea of fortune, right? So when we think of the old mythology, our mythological tradition, Marduk slays Tiamat, and Tiamat splits, right? So in that splitting, the world, the chaos is sort of rendered or rent, right? The veil is rent, and then sort of the world can exist now. Sort of is like the traditional view of it. But I feel that this is coming under some changes recently, right? So the idea here is, if we could think about a new way of looking at this idea of the north and south nodes as splitting the head and the tail of the dragon, what if we thought of Saturn as riding the dragon? And then in front of him is the head and behind him is the tail. So the Saturnic karmic force now is no longer it's not the malefic of having to slice the dragon to stop the trouble. It's riding the dragon in a personal transformation. And we'll get a little bit into Liz Green's Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil, which is a great reading. Maybe I'll just go to that for a moment here and give you guys a taste of her conclusion. We'll jump to this conclusion, Saturn, A New Look at the Old Devil by Liz Green. She goes, the science of psychology is relatively new, and has one only barely begun to demonstrate the real potential on shining light on the ambiguities of human nature. And she says here, the new direction of psychology in relation to the planet Saturn must keep pace with the acceleration of knowledge in every area of life. It has not, however, shown a capacity to keep the human sides that we are trapped under the dead weight of malefic planets, afflictions, good and bad characters, and superficial behavioral diagnoses. It is here that psychology, the newest science, can offer much to help the oldest science. I feel that Saturn is a key to this invocation of the self with its transforming potential. So in esoteric teaching, Saturn is the planet of discipleship, and a disciple is simply someone who is learning. He is not malefic. He is not a negative influence. For those who cannot understand the educational value of pain, his path is not that of the martyr or the disciplinarian, but instead, he contains the seeds of joy. Right? So this is the grounding of myth, religion, folklore, fairy tales. It's all grounded in this space, right? So the idea of transformative nature as opposed to a punishment, right? So this is against sort of luck and more like looking at the nature in depth. I'm checking out now this is from Cult of the Black Cube, and there's just a interesting passage here about the view of Saturn as Islamic Zuhal. So they talk about Zuhal here, and Saturn as Zuhal is pictured a chthonic figure in black, but also the secondary Saturnine deity of Zuhal. The dragon symbolizes dark and chaotic forces. He is not spearing or killing the animal like St. George or Archangel Michael. Rather, it is the foundation of his power. Saturn, in turn, supports the cosmology. It supports the cosmos itself. So Zuhal as Saturn becomes a sub-chthonic figure. This means he's below the chthonic, right? And I want to take this over to this Raphael depiction of Saturn, sort of in the Roman tradition, let's say. Again, Black Cube says, it shows Saturn, Raphael's depiction of Saturn is quite interesting. Let me show you the image here. Zoom that in as close as I can. You can see Saturn has his scythe and his in a chariot pulled by two dragons, which is, which evokes the two dragons of the Chinese temples, right? The left and the right dragon, or the two dragons in the Saint Michel fountain, right? Two dragons witnessing Archangel Michael subduing the devils, and the two dragons witness in power, not in death, right? They witness in presence. Raphael's depiction of Saturn is quite interesting, as he shows Saturn seated with the toga, bearing the scythe, riding in a chariot pulled by a pair of serpentine dragons. This calls to memory the images of the Islamic Zuhal, who stands atop a serpent or a dragon. Here Saturn is not conquering or slaying the dragon. Rather, Saturn is aligned with the chthonic and chaotic forces of his environment, and that they are subject to his control. Right, and this takes us to the view of just the third view mythologically. I kind of like to call out here, and that's Lord Sani. It may be that India alone, where the Saturnine cult has survived since ancient times. Master of the planets, Lord Sani, Saturn, remains a prominent deity in Indian religion. Unlike the study of Islamic Zuhal or the classic Saturnus, the study of the cult of Sani is not limited to old texts. It does not rely on reconstructions. So basically there is a direct access about viewing Sani. And again, some of the similarities across all the traditions are the animals. We'll go into some of that in Lily's book. But I kind of wanted to call out again Liz Green in her Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil. She talks about this idea of the outer planets and Saturn, which I think is very, very interesting. So as we know, Saturn used to be the last classical planet, right? And it's interesting how since modern times we've added, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto at times, right, have been astrological additions to the astrological model that used to end with Saturn. So again, this is sort of like that story I told you guys before in one of the Saturn talks. But I was having this epiphany on a beach where it was nighttime and the sky was black and the beach was black and the ocean was black, and it's just standing in this wall of blackness, right? And realizing that Saturn is not the malefic. It's not a void. Saturn is the waiting for the dawn. Saturn is attuning your eyes for less light, right? Saturn is being receptive to the idea that from the void that was made when Tiamat was split, from that, right, that's where the world begins. Right, so this idea of the engine of the worlds, I mean, it's almost on the fringes of this void are the McKenna's machine elves, who knows, fabricating the now into existence, something like this, right? So what Liz Green says about the outer planets is she says, I think it's very powerful. The idea here is the main impact of Saturn to the three outer planets lies in the fact that Saturn is the last outpost or shell of the personality, and for the majority of people, occupied in the fortifying his city walls so that no one else can get in. Before a man has come to terms with or integrated his darker half, it is rare that he can experience any feeling of a common bond with the rest of humanity, because the shadow stands between him and the others. He uses it to reaffirm his differences, to assure himself that he is better, wiser, more rational. Consequently, everyone else looks darker, and the man looks slightly lighter to himself. To this kind of man, the energies of the outer planets are like the intoxicating air of the mountain peak, but he is afraid of heights. They threaten his illusions because they carry the reality of the common or collective experience where there are no differences or barriers or basis for judgment. So this is a great sentence she says here. When this concept occurs within a relationship, the person whose Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto is involved with the contact becomes the symbol for these collective forces, which are wholly unconscious for the Saturnian. And this symbol is threatening as well as fascinating. Now here is the crux, I think, of this idea of changing the view of Saturn from a malefic, right? And he talks about the idea of psychological projection. He says it would appear that the mechanism of projection is extremely common with any Saturnine cross contact, and that projection is the source of the trouble which usually ensues with such contacts. If the individual could see himself and could withdraw his projection, he could then also see his partner clearly and would find that he is not threatened after all. These projections become especially difficult when the outer planets are involved, because so much of the mechanism is totally unconscious on the part of both persons. It is as rare to find someone who can consciously channel the energies of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as it is to find someone who has integrated Saturn, for the latter is the necessary prelude to the former. And it is also dangerous to reach the point in development, since identification with collective energies suggests the appropriation of something by an individual which in reality belongs to all. And this we call madness or megalomania. People instinctively and wisely back away from tampering with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, for they are stern deities when aroused. It is no wonder that the ancients referred to them as hidden beyond the sky, beneath the surface of the waters, or buried deep within the earth. Wow. This is a must book. Liz Green, amazing, right? And I think this is kind of where, that dragon lore really comes in, right? So what do I mean by this dragon lore? Let's take a look at this in Lily's astrology. When we talk about, I want to look for, as an exercise, just the significators of the planet Saturn. And I want to look for the things that remind me of dragons, okay? So this is the idea of, we talked earlier about using esoteric Saturn in this sort of Tiamat dragon myth, and putting that together in the sense of a Saturn transit by the north and south nodes. So let's kind of ground this exercise in the idea of an astrological hypothetical aspect between esoteric Saturn and Tiamat. Okay, and so if we go from there, Lily calls it the highest of all the planets, meaning the outermost ring, sort of, right? Capricorn and Aquarius are the houses. It talks about he is a diurnal planet, cold and dry, far from removed from the heat of the sun, and the moist vapors, melancholic, earthly, masculine, greater in fortune, author of solitariness, and malevolent. Now here we see all those old words, right? We have to read past these, because this is a book out of a certain time. And I think that there's still something very powerful that we can learn from this, especially when we get to the animals, right? So if we talk here, it says, you must observe if Saturn be oriental of the sun, the stature is more short, but decent and well composed. And they always talk about the color black. And then they have the beasts. And this I think is very interesting, because they do have a basilisk, which kind of could be just seen a bit of dragon-like, right? But there's also the cat, the hare, the mole, the elephant, the bear, the dog, the wolf, the crocodile, the scorpion, the toad, and the serpent. So again, the serpent here is the idea that is very related back to the dragon, right? I also see that it calls out the eel and the crow, right? So birds of the crow and the bat. So again, these are very, and the owl, again, right? So no dragons called out, but if you start looking at that menagerie of animals, the idea of feathered, right? You get to the Quetzalcoatl. So yeah, very, very interesting imagery coming from the Christian astrology. There's also in the EP36, I wanted to just show this image in the illustrations of Saturn. So Saturn here, it says how to speak to Saturn in the section of the EP36. And you see Saturn here is depicted, again, with the stag's head, with the sickle, with the arrow, and also riding upon the back of the dragon. And then you see Saturn with the north node and the south node. So Saturn, by centering yourself in the fortune, what you're really doing is you're placing oneself at the karmic, I want to call it like an inflection point, right? So let's see sort of what Liz has to say about this. If we go back to this new way of looking at Saturn. So the concept here is looking at a Saturn in a horoscope that may have traditionally be thought of as a malefic. It says, I also do not feel it is possible to come anywhere near a comprehension of Saturn without an additional perspective, for I believe that Saturn is the key to this invocation of the self with its transforming potential. In esoteric teaching, Saturn is a planet of discipleship, and a disciple is simply someone who is learning. He is not a malefic, he is not a negative influence, and is only inimicable to those who cannot understand the educational value of pain. His lineage is ancient and impeccable, and his associations in the world of myth, religion, folklore, and fairy tale are innumerable and varied. Yet always by the idea that instead of running away from the devil, if one goes up and kisses him on the lips, he becomes the sun. So what I may personally feel or intuit or experience or think about Saturn has not really been articulated, for even if you were to amplify the analysis 100 times greater in detail, or if you attempted to structure it in 100 different ways, the presentation would necessarily be inadequate, because Saturn is a symbol, and as a symbol it cannot be comprehended by words and has to be approached through the intuitive faculty. Right, so an attempt has been made to suggest that Saturn is far more than it seems. So there's the question here is a practical question about self-development. Right, just like in the early days of psychology, it was a talking cure. It was an interaction, right? And what I think is great about having this podcast as a forum is, leave your comments below. If something has given you an idea, let's share it. Let's comment on it. Let's talk about it. Let's sort of build that dialogue, right? And this is, again, where we're riding that dragon imagery, right? Again, we're not avoiding it or destroying it. We're saying, hey, we're in the midst of the world. If you think of it as a fiction writer in world building, there is definitely some inflation, right? You have to inflate to understand. You're projecting out some kind of ideas onto the blank page, let's call it, for a writer. But in our personal lives, that kind of ego inflation, that kind of Jungian inflation can be a dangerous sign or a dangerous separation from reality. But what one can do is with two eyes, as the Sufis used to say, right? One eye, you can view the inflation, and one eye you can view. Sister Ray came on somehow. One eye you can view the inflation, and one eye you can view the. You can see that the separation and the grounding of the inflation is where you say, okay, I'm not really a dragon. I'm not really riding a dragon. There's not really a dragon being slain. It's just a kind of a story that one can use to self-understand one's role in the current situation, right? So this is, again, riding the dragon. The north node and the south node opens the fortune. You put Saturn into that space, and you can learn from that space, okay? And I think that intuition in astrology, I'm going to kind of call out this Bensimagos, Moons of the Planets, because in this book, each of the satellites of the planets are given some properties that I think also can be skimmed for the dragon kind of narrative. For example, we have this call out to Tolkien's music of Iluvatar with Pan, the moon Pan of Saturn, with the chapter of music, sound, and chaos, where the sort of the music kind of emerges suddenly, like Sister Ray did. And then the idea of Atlas is stability, Prometheus is science, Pandora is depth and chaos, Janus is prestige and honor, Epimetheus caution, Mimas is restraints, Enceladus is acquisition, Tethys is defensive, Telesto is opulent, Calypso is silent and delayed, Dione is serious and melancholic, Helene is crystallizing, Rhea is wisdom of experience. Then we have Titan himself, which is the name given to the Titans. And we have to always remember with Saturn slew Uranus, right? And then once again Saturn ate the children of the Olympians. So you can see that we get back to even the Greek mythology. All of those mythological traditions sort of try to frame us in a lineage back to that dragon force. But by taking the Saturnine view of processing karma, being transformative in one's life, taking that thing, Liz Green talks about it as, in the past, psychology was something for sick people. But now it's something that people who just want to be more present and more aware can take it upon themselves to do that, what Jung might have called the integration of the unconscious work, right? But I think it's even maybe it's just simplified as an openness to being in the world, right? And I think that this is a great place to sort of leave off with the podcast this week. I think next week I want to go into one of these kind of inflation stories. I was using some of the, I don't know if you guys have seen this text-generated AI software that's out there now, where you type in natural language and then it just draws an image for you. And I thought we would do an experiment next week based on this idea of the Lawrence Gardner books. I think we'll kind of review those Bloodline of the Holy Grail books as sort of a framework for it. But the idea of the dragon bloodline and the Christ bloodline, and then just kind of put that together in sort of I'll go through what I'll call like an active imagination. So you can think of it as, let's think of it as a retrocausal re-imaging of the myths, just as a personal exploration. So I'll guide you guys through it together and we can walk through it together. But the idea was, and I will also do some visuals with it. So I'll take some of those generated images and we'll guide through that. That'll be our next podcast. So if you guys are interested, like and subscribe below. You can ring the bell. Please, if you have anything some kind of idea that popped up from this podcast, would love to hear from you. If there's something that you guys must be smarter than me on, cue me into it, whether it's the nodes of the dragon head and tail of the astrological nodes, some ideas of aspects to the nodes. I'd love to see some comments on that. And also anything that you guys know about Saturn, esoteric dragon lore, Picatrix, or Christian astrology. Bring those up. Cult of the Black Cubes, always a fan favorite. So thanks a lot, guys, for watching. If you would like to know when we're notified for the next podcast, you can ring the bell, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.